I never planned to end up in a stranger's truck on a night like that. I was supposed to be in a warm cabin by 6 p.m., unpacking my books and settling into a winter research internship at the regional observatory. That was the plan. Simple, boring, reliable. But the road had other ideas. Somewhere between mile marker 12 and a turn I never saw coming, my car lost traction on the icy slope. 1 minute I was driving carefully, eyes on the curve, and the next, I was spinning. The world turned sideways. The trees blurred. My breath locked in my throat as the front of the car slammed into a snowbank. And just like that, I was stuck. The heater wheezed but barely kept up with the cold. Cell signal? Non-existent. I tried digging around the wheels with my snow scraper until my fingers went numb. No use. Darkness was falling fast, and the cold was no longer something I could ignore. That's when I saw headlights. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, some kind of frost-induced mirage. But the lights grew closer, and then the shape of an old pickup truck emerged from the snowfall. It pulled up beside me without any fanfare. No honk, no rush. A tall man stepped out, wearing a flannel-lined coat, thick boots, and a look that said he wasn't used to talking much. His beard was trimmed but graying at the chin, and his eyes looked like they'd seen more winters than I'd lived through. "You stuck?" he asked, voice low and flat. I nodded, teeth chattering. I tried digging out. No signal. I was heading to the observatory. He didn't ask more, just gave the car a quick glance, then jerked his head toward his truck. "Come on, you won't get it out tonight." I hesitated. Every true crime documentary I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. He must have sensed it, because he added, "Nearest town's 8 miles that way. You'll freeze before help finds you." His voice wasn't threatening. It was just matter of fact. No inflection, no warmth, but no cruelty either. Just a man stating reality. I got in. The truck smelled like pine and diesel. A blanket was folded neatly on the passenger seat. He handed it to me without a word. The heater rattled but worked. We drove in silence, headlights cutting through the snowfall like a slow heartbeat. After maybe 15 minutes, the truck turned off the main road onto a narrow path flanked by evergreens and thick drifts. A small wooden sign, barely visible, read, "Hillcrest Ranch." I wanted to ask questions, but the silence between us felt dense, like anything I said might fracture it. So I wrapped the blanket tighter and stared ahead. The house was a simple log cabin tucked against the woods. Smoke curled from the chimney. There were no Christmas lights, no decorations. Just one porch light glowing amber through the cold. He parked, got out, and opened my door before I could react. I stepped down carefully, snow crunching under my boots. "House is warm," he said. "You can call your people in the morning." He walked ahead without checking if I followed. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. The air smelled of firewood and something faintly metallic, like old tools and pine sap. There were boots lined neatly by the door. A wood-burning stove clicked in the corner. The walls were bare except for a faded photograph above the mantel. A young woman on a horse, smiling like she didn't know the world could hurt her. "I'm Jacob," he said, shrugging off his coat. "Lily," I replied, still clutching the blanket. He nodded once. "There's soup? And dry clothes if you want." Then he disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen. No small talk, no questions, just space. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I'd stepped into a dream or someone else's paused life. But the fire crackled, the floor didn't creak under my weight, and my fingers started to feel again. I didn't know it yet, but that night, the one that derailed every plan I had, would be the first page in a story I never meant to write. And Jacob Monroe? He wasn't just the man who rescued me from the snow. He would become the reason I never wanted to leave. I woke to the soft hiss of firewood and the distant sound of hooves against frozen earth. The couch beneath me was firmer than I remembered, the wool blanket scratchier. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the scent of smoke and pine reminded me. This wasn't a guest house or a lodge, it was someone's life, and I had walked into it uninvited. I folded the blanket and looked around. The room hadn't changed overnight, but I saw it differently now. No photos on the shelves, no books stacked in corners. Just practical things. Gloves hung to dry, a fire poker leaning against the bricks, a wall clock that ticked just loud enough to notice when no one was speaking. Jacob wasn't in sight, but I heard him outside, low murmurs and the soft rustle of hay. I hesitated before opening the door, unsure of the unspoken boundaries in a home like his. The morning hit like breath from the earth itself, sharp, clean, unfiltered. The sky was a washed-out blue, the kind you only see above snowfields, stretched thin like someone had rinsed all the color out of it. Jacob was near the stable, tossing feed into troughs with the kind of rhythm that came from years of doing it alone. His movements were slow, precise. He didn't look up when I stepped out, didn't call to me, didn't smile. Just kept working, as if I were another tree on the ridge. There was no radio playing, no barking dog, just him, the horses, and the cold. "Morning," I offered, stepping into the snow. He paused long enough to nod. "You sleep okay?" I nodded back. "Thanks for the blanket." Another nod. Then he returned to work. I waited a minute, then wandered toward the fence. The horses didn't shy away, but they didn't approach either. I watched him, for a while, how he checked each hoof, touched each muzzle like he was memorizing them, like he needed to feel their breath to know the day had begun. He wasn't unkind, just practiced at solitude. After a while, he asked if I wanted coffee. We sat at the kitchen table with mismatched mugs. Mine said, Texas Rodeo, 1983. His was plain and cracked at the rim. He didn't ask me questions. I didn't volunteer much. But somehow, the silence wasn't tense. Just heavy. Like it had been there long before I arrived, and now I was borrowing it. There was something about the way he looked at things. Longer than most people, but never directly. He'd glance, then glance away, as if locking eyes would cost too much. I asked, eventually, "You live here alone?" He didn't look up. Mostly. Mostly. I didn't ask what that meant. I just nodded, pretending it made sense. A photo on the fridge caught my attention, taped at the corner, fading at the edges. A woman on a horse, different from the one over the fireplace. Younger, maybe. Her smile was the kind that made you want to know the joke. Jacob saw me looking but said nothing. Just took another sip of his coffee. We spent the rest of the morning like that. He worked. I tried to help. He never asked, but he never stopped me either. At lunch, he reheated soup from a pot that had probably been there since last night. We ate at the table. No grace, no words. Just two people with spoons and tired hands. By mid-afternoon, I'd learned more from his silences than most men's monologues. He was the kind of person who didn't fill space just to prove he existed. He let the air breathe on its own. That night, as I stood in the hallway brushing my teeth with a travel-sized kit from my bag, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My hair was messy, my sweater stretched, but there was something steadier in my eyes. Back in the living room, Jacob had laid out clean sheets on the couch again. "You don't have to," I said, gesturing to the blanket. He shrugged. "It's cold." His voice didn't give away anything else. No discomfort, no warmth, just fact. I thanked him again, unsure if he heard me. As he turned to leave, I noticed it. Just for a second, he paused, like there was something he wanted to say but couldn't quite justify. Then the moment passed. He disappeared into the hall, and the house returned to its quiet pulse. That night, I didn't sleep immediately. I lay there listening to the creaks in the walls, to the wind brushing past the eaves. And I thought about people who choose lives like his, not because they're running, but because they've already arrived somewhere too far for most to follow. And yet, I was here. The second morning felt quieter, even though the snow had stopped falling. The world outside the cabin was dipped in white and still, like someone had pressed pause on everything that breathed. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of boots in the snow, and Jacob's silhouette moving from the barn to the feed room like clockwork. I pulled on the oversized coat he'd loaned me, stepped into my stiff boots by the door, and followed him out without a word. The horses were already awake, breath clouding the air in gentle bursts. Jacob worked in silence, tossing hay, checking water, moving with that same deliberate energy I was beginning to associate with him. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. I fell in beside him, mimicking what I could, and when he didn't stop me, I kept going. There was something oddly grounding about shoveling straw beside a man who never asked what you were running from. By mid-morning, my hands were aching and my thighs burned, but I didn't complain. The cold had become less biting, or maybe it was just that being useful dulled the edge of being out of place. We led the horses out to a fenced paddock. That's when I noticed it. A second cabin, about 40 yards behind the barn. Not the main house, not a storage shed. It was small, but solid. Shuttered windows. Chimney intact. The door was shut tight. A padlock clamped around the latch. I tilted my head toward it. Is that another guest house? Jacob barely glanced in that direction. No. That was it. Just, no. I waited, thinking he might say more, but he didn't. He walked past me, brushing snow off his jacket as if I hadn't spoken. Something about the way he moved around that structure, always giving it space, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just closed. It was off limits. Later, when we brought the horses back in, I caught myself looking toward that cabin again. I couldn't help it. It felt like a story with no title, one he wasn't ready to tell. Inside the barn, he reached for a toolbox, fixing a broken hinge on one of the stall gates. I handed him nails without asking. The quiet between us was less uncomfortable now, but more charged. You built that second cabin? I asked gently. He didn't look up, just said, yeah. Before or after you moved here? He paused. Same year, he said. Long time ago. That's all he offered. Not sharp, not defensive. Just final. I knew I should have let it go, but something about the way the snow gathered perfectly along the rooftop, undisturbed, made me wonder how long that place had been sealed shut. I'm sorry, I said after a beat. I didn't mean to pry. He nodded. Not as an answer, more like an acknowledgement. A line drawn, but not reinforced. We finished the rest of the chores in silence. Back inside, he heated chili on the stove and left the room without a word. I stood by the window, watching the second cabin through the frost on the glass. The wind picked up, brushing powder off the roof in little spirals. Someone had once lived in that place, or was supposed to. Maybe both. When Jacob returned, he handed me a bowl and sat across from me at the table. The silence was softer now, even with everything left unsaid. It was like we were both waiting for the other to speak, but not in a hurry to break the quiet. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me. Not fully. Just that sideways glance he did sometimes. You planning on leaving tomorrow? The question startled me. I haven't decided, I said honestly. He nodded, returning to his spoon. We didn't talk about it again. But that night, as I lay under the blanket on his couch, I stared at the ceiling and couldn't stop thinking about that locked cabin. About the way he'd said no. Like it was the only word that belonged there. I didn't want to invade his life. But I was already inside it, at least the part he let people see. Still, I had the growing sense that something had been left unfinished out there in the snow. Not abandoned. Just waiting for someone to ask again. The third morning, the wind had settled, but the quiet hadn't. Jacob went about his routine like usual. Early, precise, never wasting a step. I followed him to the barn, helped with feed and water, brushed one of the older mares he'd called Daisy. She leaned into me like she'd known me for years, not days. Afterward, While Jacob repaired a section of the paddock fence, I asked if I could stay inside to warm up. He nodded, handed me the keys, and didn't say another word. I hadn't been alone in the house since I arrived. The silence indoors felt different without him in it. More hollow, more revealing. I made tea, wandered the living room, ran a finger across the mantel. The fire was still low from earlier, and the kettle hissed just slightly behind me. Everything in the house was placed with purpose, but there was no decoration, no clutter, no softness. Except one thing. A cedar chest tucked beside the bookshelf. I hesitated before opening it. It didn't feel locked, just personal. Inside were wool blankets, a folded flannel shirt, and at the very top, wrapped in thin tissue, was a cream-colored handkerchief. Delicate, with pale blue embroidery in the corner. A letter R, stitched by hand. It didn't match anything else in the house. It didn't belong to the same world Jacob now inhabited. It belonged to someone who had once wanted beauty in the small things. Someone with patient fingers. I held it for a long moment before gently folding it again, returning it exactly as I'd found it. That's when I noticed the photo, wedged between the last two books on the shelf. Not framed, just left there. It must have slipped down or been placed out of sight deliberately. Two people stood in front of the second cabin. A younger Jacob, with one hand resting on the small of a woman's back. She had a wild smile and thick hair pulled into a braid. Her hand rested on his chest like she belonged there. The photo wasn't dated, but it didn't have to be. I set it on the table and stared at it. The locked cabin, the stitched initial, the way he never looked at me straight on. I felt something begin to take shape. A presence. Not ghostly, just suspended. When Jacob walked in, snow dusted across his shoulders, I was still holding the photo. He froze. I placed it gently on the table, not hiding it, not apologizing. "Is this her?" I asked. He didn't move. His jaw tightened. He looked down at his gloves instead of me. "Her name was Rachel," he said after a pause. Past tense. Quiet but clear. I nodded. "Did she live here?" He shook his head. Number she was going to. The answer hit harder than I expected. I looked down at the photo again. There was a kind of joy in it that didn't match anything about this house. A life that had started, but never finished. "She's the reason for the second cabin?" He didn't answer right away. Just took off his gloves, sat down across from me, and stared at the fire. "I built it for us. Started after we got engaged. She picked out the tile, drew little sketches on napkins of how she wanted the porch to wrap around, said she'd plant lavender under the kitchen window." His voice wasn't bitter. If anything, it was tired, like he hadn't said these words in years and they'd stiffened from lack of use. "What happened?" I asked softly. "She died. Car accident. 2 weeks before we were supposed to move in." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was so full I could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He nodded once, then looked at me, not directly, but long enough that I felt it. I locked the place up that day and never went back in. Couldn't bring myself to finish what we started. So I finished nothing at all. I didn't know what to say. I didn't try to fix it with sympathy or promises. Some wounds don't want stitching. They just need space to ache. After a while, he stood, took the photo gently from the table and slipped it back between the books. He didn't hide it. He just returned it to its place. "I'm not asking you to forget," I said before he could walk away. "But maybe it's okay to let someone see what you've been carrying." He paused, his hand resting on the back of the chair. Then he spoke. Quiet. Careful. "You didn't ask. You just listened." And with that, he disappeared into the back hallway, leaving me alone with the fire, the kettle, and the ache of something sacred that had once tried to grow roots here. That morning, the coffee tasted different. Maybe it was just the way my hands wrapped around the mug like I was holding something fragile. Or maybe it was because we didn't rush the silence between us. Jacob had poured the mugs, slid one across the table to me without a word, and sat in the chair he always did. One leg bent slightly outward like he was halfway to standing, even when he wasn't going anywhere. We sat there, steam rising between us, saying nothing. But it didn't feel like avoidance anymore. It felt like something was being said, just not out loud. The night before still sat between us. The photograph, the embroidered handkerchief, Rachel. Her name hadn't echoed through the house in a long time, and now that it had, it felt like the air had shifted to make room for it. I sipped slowly, the heat stinging just enough to remind me I was still present. And then, maybe because I couldn't hold all the weight of his story without offering some of my own, I spoke. My mom used to tell me that when someone we love dies, they become a star, I said, my voice barely above the creak of the wood stove. She said every time I looked up at the sky, someone was looking back. Jacob didn't lift his eyes, but I saw it. The small tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the mug. A reaction without sound. She believed in things most people laughed at, I continued. Not religion, not really, but light, patterns. She thought the universe wasn't random, just not understood yet. She'd lie with me on the porch when I was little and point out constellations I could barely pronounce. I glanced at him, still silent, still listening. When she got sick, I asked her if she was afraid. I said. She said, "No, I'm just curious what kind of star I'll be." The lump in my throat came fast, unexpected. It had been years since I'd said those words out loud. Years since I'd heard them in her voice. Jacob still didn't speak, but he set his mug down slowly and folded his hands together, elbows on the table like he was bracing himself against something invisible. I took another sip and stared at the worn ring in the wood beneath my cup. I wondered how many mornings had started this way here. Quiet, practical, unadorned. And how many of those mornings he'd spent alone. I think that's why I went into astrophysics, I said after a pause. Not because I'm brilliant or want to work for NASA. Just because I want to understand what she believed in. I want to prove that the light we lose doesn't disappear. It just changes form. Jacob shifted in his chair, leaned back slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine. There was no pity in them, no disbelief, just a kind of recognition, a knowing. She sounds like someone who'd make a hell of a good cup of coffee, he said quietly. I smiled. It was the first thing he'd said in 20 minutes, and somehow, it was exactly what I needed. She did, I whispered. Always too strong, always in a chipped floral mug. She'd tell me if your coffee doesn't wake you up and humble you a little, it's not worth drinking. Jacob huffed a soft breath that might have been a laugh. Or maybe just an exhale that forgot to be guarded. The room settled again. Not into silence, but into something more delicate. The kind of calm that only comes after you've opened a door and found someone still standing on the other side. He stood and refilled both mugs without asking, moving slower now, like the pace of the house had adjusted to something human again. I don't talk about her much, I said, wrapping my hands around the warm porcelain again. You don't have to, he replied. You remember her right. And for a man who barely used words, that felt like the highest praise. The next morning, we didn't speak, but something had changed. The silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bridge. Narrow, maybe a little creaky, but strong enough to cross if we both stepped carefully. Jacob poured the coffee the same way he always did. 2 mugs. One for him, one for me. No cream, no sugar. Just black, bold, steady. Like him. We sat across from each other, both hands wrapped around warm ceramic. The wind outside rattled the window panes, but inside, everything felt still. It was strange how a routine could become sacred without anyone ever declaring it so. How 2 people could begin to sync not through grand gestures or confessions, but through shared silence and the rhythm of breath and steam. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me, just for a second, before turning his eyes back to the wood grain of the table or the snow outside. Other times, I'd look up and realize we'd both been staring at the same thing without realizing it. The way the morning light hit the frost on the windowsill, or how Daisy's hooves crunched through the snow outside the barn. We never acknowledged it. Never said, "I saw you looking." But I knew. And he knew I knew. There was a kind of intimacy in that. A trust built not on words, but on the absence of them. One morning, 5 days after the photo, I set my mug down and said, "You make good coffee." He didn't reply right away. He just gave a slight nod, and the corner of his mouth twitched like it wanted to smile but hadn't remembered how. "I learned from someone who liked it too strong," he finally said. I didn't press him. Didn't ask if he meant Rachel or someone before that. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he answered. That he let something out into the air and didn't try to take it back. Later that day, I found a small metal kettle sitting on the back porch. It was old, the handle slightly warped, but clean. My name wasn't on it, but somehow I knew it was for me. I brought it inside, filled it, and used it the next morning. Jacob didn't comment, but his eyes dropped to the kettle when I poured our coffee. And for the first time, he took the mug with both hands instead of just one. It felt like a nod, an unspoken agreement. We were building something, slowly, cautiously, like stacking stones on uneven ground, but it was something. The days settled into a rhythm. We fed the horses, mended the fence line, took shifts hauling firewood. Sometimes we spoke, about weather, or the stubborn hinge on the barn door. But mostly, we just existed near each other. And that nearness stopped feeling accidental. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found a second chair pulled slightly closer to the wood stove. Just a few inches, but enough. I sat in it. He didn't say anything. But that day, when I poured the coffee, he added a splash of milk to mine. Just once. Just enough to notice. I never told him I liked it that way. From then on, he always did. I found myself listening for the soft creak of his boots on the wood floor, the scrape of a chair leg, the quiet clink of ceramic. Each sound felt more and more like part of a song I was learning to hum along with. And once, when he reached for the sugar canister, just out of habit maybe, I saw his sleeve right up. There, stitched onto the cuff of his flannel shirt were tiny initials, RM. The thread was the same pale blue as the embroidery on the handkerchief I'd found, but he didn't flinch when I saw it, didn't tug the sleeve down or turn away. He just kept stirring. A small offering, a memory worn into fabric. Not hidden, not erased, just carried. The next morning, I wore my mother's necklace, a small silver star on a thin chain. It wasn't flashy, just personal. I didn't say anything about it, but I knew he noticed. His eyes lingered for just a second longer than usual when he handed me the mug, and that was enough. Sometimes you don't need to explain your scars. You just need someone who won't look away from them. And in that quiet, winter-wrapped kitchen, between 2 mugs of coffee, I realized something simple and terrifying. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The forecast had said snow, but no forecast could have warned me about the kind of silence that came with a storm like that. By late afternoon, the wind howled like it had teeth. Thick sheets of white swallowed the road, the fences, even the barn in the distance. When I tried the door, snow had already drifted halfway up the steps. Jacob didn't say anything. He just handed me a blanket and added another log to the fire. "This one's not going anywhere," he finally muttered, eyes fixed on the swirling gray outside the window. I sat down near the hearth, the crackling flames throwing gold against the cabin walls. The old wooden beams creaked, not from the cold, but from memory. The kind of memory that lives in a house like this, where silence and survival sit side by side. "I guess I'm stuck here," I said softly. He didn't answer right away. He poured 2 cups of coffee, his way of saying, "Yes, you are." It was already dark when the lights flickered once, then went out completely. I blinked at the sudden absence of sound. No hum of electricity, no ticking clock. Just the storm outside, and the fire inside. Jacob stood, walked to the cabinet, and lit 2 oil lamps without comment. The glow was soft, amber, like the kind that makes everything look older and more honest. We sat again, this time on the rug, closer to the warmth. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of unasked questions and half-meant glances. "I've never seen snow like this," I said. He looked over. "It'll bury the whole road by morning." A pause, then softer. "Happens about once a winter. Last time, I was alone here for 4 days." I looked at him. That must have been quiet. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker, like the word quiet meant something different to him. "I didn't mind it at first," he said. "There's comfort in knowing no one expects anything from you." "And after a few days?" He stared into the fire. "You start wishing someone did." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even sad. It was just honest. And somehow, that made it more powerful. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped the blanket tighter. I used to think I liked being alone, until my mom got sick. Then I realized, being alone isn't the same as being at peace. He didn't move, but I could feel the weight of his attention, like the room itself had leaned slightly toward me. "She passed 2 years ago. I kept pretending I was fine. Told everyone I was too busy to come home for holidays, too caught up with work. But the truth was, I didn't know how to walk into a quiet house and not hear her voice." Jacob didn't offer condolences, and I was grateful for that. Instead, he said, "This place used to echo with someone else's laugh too. Rachel." He still hadn't said her name out loud, but I felt her. In the folded quilts, the careful order of books on the shelf, in the way he still stirred sugar into just 1 mug, even though he only drank his black. He poked at the fire with the iron rod, sending up a small spray of sparks. "She planted those lilacs out back," he said after a while. "Said she didn't care if the deer ate them. Let them have something sweet," she told me. I turned toward him. "Did they bloom this year?" He nodded. "Just for a week. Then the frost came early." We fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A shared one. I reached for the second log, handed it to him. Our fingers touched, just briefly, but it was the first time I didn't pull away. Outside, the storm kept howling. Inside, the fire popped and hissed like it had secrets. "Do you ever wish you'd left?" I asked. He stared into the flame for a long time. "No," he said. "I just wish I'd known someone would come back." I swallowed hard. There was something about that answer that knocked the wind out of me, not because it was romantic, but because it was true. Sometimes we don't need rescue. We just need to know we're not waiting alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the storm still raging outside, or the way the logs snapped in the fireplace like they had something urgent to say, or maybe it was Jacob, sitting in the old chair across the room, reading by lamplight, his profile carved in fire and shadow. I watched the flames dance on the ceiling and listened to the quiet in my own chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't loneliness. It was something unfamiliar. Something like being safe. Around midnight, I shifted on the couch, winced as a dull ache ran down my spine. Jacob looked up. "You all right?" "Just stiff," I murmured. "This couch isn't made for anyone over 5'2". He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. "You don't have to sleep there," he said. "You can take the bed. I'm not kicking you out of your own room." I wasn't offering it empty. The fire cracked. A log fell, revealing a fresh, glowing core. I sat up slowly. "Are you sure?" His eyes met mine. I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't. He didn't reach for me, didn't coax or insist. He simply waited. I followed him down the narrow hallway, past the locked door I'd once tried to open, and into a space I hadn't entered until now. The bedroom was simple. No clutter. No photographs. Just the scent of cedar and clean cotton, and a bed that looked older than both of us put together. He turned down the covers without ceremony, then stepped aside to let me in first. It wasn't rushed. There was no firestorm of limbs, no hurried passion like in the movies. Just breathe. Shared warmth. The brush of fingertips on bare skin, tentative and reverent. When his hand touched my side, I shivered. Cold? He asked against my neck. I shook my head. Number just nervous. He pulled back slightly. We don't have to. I know. I whispered. I want to. I've never. The words caught in my throat. He stilled. Completely. Then, gently, his fingers brushed a strand of hair from my cheek. Then we take it slow, he said. And you lead. And so we did. Everything slowed. The room became small. The world, even smaller. Just the two of us, skin against skin, breath sinking like a language only we knew. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't choreographed. But it was real. And when it was over, we didn't move. I lay on my side, heart thudding against his ribs, wondering if I'd just stepped over a line I couldn't ever go back from. Maybe I didn't want to. He traced a circle on my shoulder, then whispered something so quiet I almost missed it. You're not what I expected. I turned slightly. What did you expect? His voice was hoarse. Someone passing through. Someone looking for a story to tell when they got back to their world. And now? He looked at me. Now I'm scared you'll stay, and I won't know what to do with that. I didn't answer. I just reached for his hand beneath the blanket, laced my fingers through his. The fire burned low. The wind cried against the windows. But in that room, under the weight of quiet truth, something fragile and unspoken settled between us. Not a promise, but maybe the beginning of one. When I woke, he was already gone. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, the air chilled slightly in his absence. I reached toward the spot where he'd lain hours earlier. It was still warm, but empty. I pulled the blanket tighter, sat up slowly, and that's when I saw it. A small bloom of red, no larger than a pressed thumb, on the corner of the white cotton sheet. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream. It simply existed, quietly, unmistakably. And yet, I froze. Not from shame, not from regret, but from something deeper, like seeing a thread of myself woven into the fabric of this house. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard movement from outside. I rose, wrapped myself in the old flannel robe hanging from the hook on the wall, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped. The world was blanketed in stillness, the kind that makes everything seem new, untouched, except for him. Jacob was in the yard, his back to me, bent over a patch near the fence where the snow had melted just enough to reveal the stubborn heads of wildflowers, red-tipped, despite the cold. He picked 3, turned, and saw me. He didn't look at the robe I wore, or the tangle of my hair, or even the faint flush that still warmed my face. His eyes locked with mine, calm, unreadable. And then, slowly, he held up the small bundle of flowers like a peace offering. No words, no smirk, just presence. When he came inside, he brushed the snow from his boots, set the flowers in a chipped glass jar, and placed them on the table between our 2 coffee mugs. I watched him silently. You didn't have to, I said. He looked over. I know. He filled the kettle with water. The familiarity of the gesture made my chest tighten. You're not surprised, I said quietly. He paused, turned slightly. Should I be? I just thought, maybe you'd be distant, cold. That's usually how these stories go. Jacob placed a tin of cocoa mix beside the mugs. I don't live in stories, Lily. I folded my arms. Neither do I. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by silence and soft heat. Then he turned the stove knob, lit the flame, and said, almost to himself, "It didn't change how I see you. If anything, it reminded me you're real." His words settled between us like fresh snow, quiet but impossible to ignore. He poured the steaming water, stirred gently, then slid one mug toward me. The cocoa wasn't too sweet. It never was with him. Just warm, earthy, honest. I lifted the mug to my lips. The smell of cinnamon and something darker, like clove or memory. Outside, the sky had turned a pale blue, the kind that always comes after a storm. Too bright, almost forgiving. Inside, the flowers on the table leaned slightly in the jar, red tips trembling in the heat from the stove. Jacob reached across, adjusted the corner of the sheet near the fire, smoothing it like he was taming a thought. And I realized something then. He had seen the red, and instead of shame, he brought color. Instead of pulling away, he made cocoa, picked wildflowers, sat across from me like nothing had to be said, because everything already had. In his world, love wasn't announced. It was placed quietly in a chipped jar, stirred into a mug, folded into a gesture. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in that world. I felt like I had a seat at the table. The cocoa had long gone cold, but neither of us moved. The jar of flowers on the table had started to lean, one stem drooping slightly as if weighed by the warmth inside. Or maybe by what wasn't being said. I turned the mug in my hands, fingertips tracing the chipped ceramic. "It was my first time," I said, voice barely above the soft crackle of the fire. "But I guess you already knew." Jacob didn't answer right away. He didn't nod or shift uncomfortably. He just looked at me. Really looked. "I knew," he said finally. "And you weren't surprised." I wasn't. I hesitated. "Why?" He leaned back slightly, folding his arms as if he were holding something invisible in his chest. "Because you carried it like someone who had waited long enough to mean it." His words sat with me longer than I expected. I let out a breath, something fragile and tired. Most men would have treated it like a prize. He blinked once. Then most men are fools. There was no flattery in his tone, just quiet truth. Like he wasn't trying to impress me, only to reflect what he'd seen. And that, somehow, meant more. I turned toward the window. The sky outside was clearing, the sun catching on the branches, casting long shadows across the snow. A world trying to start over. "I didn't plan for this," I said. "Any of it." I don't think either of us did. We sat for a while without words. It wasn't awkward, just spacious. Like there was finally enough room in the silence for both of us to breathe. Then I spoke again. "Thank you." He looked up. "For what?" "For last night. For being gentle." Jacob's gaze dropped slightly. "It wasn't about being gentle." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He met my eyes again. "It was about listening. You didn't say much, but I heard you. The way your hands trembled. The way you held your breath when I touched your shoulder. You didn't need to explain anything, Lily. You just needed someone who wouldn't take." That's when I felt it. Not love. Not yet. But a crack in the armor. A warmth where I'd grown used to flinching. He stood and moved toward the stove, then paused, back turned. "I've never said this to anyone," he said. "But, thank you." I blinked. "For what?" "For trusting me." My breath caught. He faced me again, expression unreadable. "You didn't owe me that. Trust like that. It's not given lightly, especially from someone who's learned to guard herself." I swallowed. "You notice that too?" "Hard not to. You sleep like someone waiting to run." That made me smile, not because it was funny, but because it was true, and because hearing it didn't make me want to hide. "I don't know what this is," I said, "or what it means, but for once, I don't feel like I have to earn my place just to be wanted." Jacob nodded. "You don't." Those two words, simple, solid, hit deeper than any declaration. Because for the first time, I wasn't being begged to stay. I wasn't being kept out of obligation or pity. And I wasn't being tolerated. I was chosen. Not because I was perfect, Not because I was convenient, but because someone saw me, quiet, bruised edges and all, and stayed anyway. He didn't touch me this time, didn't reach for my hand or try to close the space between us. Instead, he said, "Let's go for a walk. It's warmer now." I nodded. As we stepped out into the pale sun and the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves, I realized something. It wasn't the red thread on the sheet that marked a beginning. It was this. A man who saw the thread and brought flowers. A man who heard without needing every word. A man who chose me without asking me to explain who I used to be. It happened without announcement. One morning, after feeding the horses and fixing the barn latch for the third time, Jacob turned to me with that familiar stillness in his eyes and said, "There's something I want to show you." His voice was even, not dramatic, but something in it made me stand straighter. He didn't wait for an answer. Just started walking toward the back of the property, past the rows of pine trees and the old stone wall that marked the edge of his land. I followed. We stopped in front of the cabin I'd noticed on my first morning there, the one with the warped porch and windows covered in dust, the one whose door had always been locked. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single iron key. "Never found a good reason to open it again," he said, "until now." The door creaked as it swung open, hesitant and stiff, like even the hinges had grown used to silence. Inside, it was dim, cold, but not forgotten. Wood planks leaned against the far wall. A sink still wrapped in plastic sat in a corner. Cans of paint lined the floor, unopened. The smell of sawdust and thyme filled the air. He stepped in first, brushing dust off a covered table. It was supposed to be finished by now. I moved beside him, my breath catching as I took it all in. There was no furniture, no warmth, just intention and abandonment. "What happened?" I asked softly. He didn't answer at first, just walked to the far wall where pencil lines had been drawn to mark measurements. One of them had a name scribbled faintly next to it. Emily. I froze. "She wanted the windows wide," Jacob said, "so the sun would reach the floor in the morning, and she wanted a yellow wall here, said it would make winters feel shorter." His voice wasn't bitter, just tired. I looked around again, at the way the walls stood but weren't painted, at how the frame was built, but the story had stopped mid-sentence. "This was going to be your home?" I asked. He nodded. "Ours." I stepped closer. "Why didn't it happen?" "She got sick before we finished it," he said. Fast. Unexpected. And when she went, I couldn't find the will to keep building something she'd never live in. Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable, just reverent. He picked up a dried flower pressed between two boards and turned it in his fingers. Some people leave with their words. Others leave with the things they never finished. I didn't know what to say, so I reached out, touching the beam closest to me, feeling its rough texture. "It's beautiful, even in this state." "It's unfinished," he replied. "Maybe that's why it still breathes." He looked over at me then, not as the man who had pulled me from the snow or the one who made cocoa without asking, but as someone slowly peeling back the layers he'd used to survive. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. Jacob paused. "Because I never brought anyone here, and I wanted to see what it looked like, through your eyes." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a room with bare walls. It was the space between mourning and healing, between memory and movement. And he had let me in, not to erase what was, but to acknowledge it, to share it. I stepped into the center of the room, turned in a slow circle. "I like the light here," I said, "even if the windows are still dusty." He smiled faintly. She would have liked that. We stood there a while longer in the middle of what never got to be, and yet, somehow, it didn't feel like a place of loss. It felt like a place waiting for a second beginning. He didn't hand it to me like it was sacred. He slid it across the table after lunch, 2 cups still warm, the plate of toast untouched between us. The paper was yellowed around the edges, A corner curled like it had been pressed flat too many times. I looked down. A house plan. The cabin. Rough pencil sketches of a layout that hadn't been finished. Open kitchen, 2 bedrooms, wide porch. Scribbled notes in the margins, some smudged beyond reading. In one corner, a single name in soft cursive. Emily's pantry space? I let the silence stretch. You kept this? I asked, eyes still scanning. Jacob nodded slowly. It was in the drawer beneath the spare tools. I hadn't looked at it in years. And now? He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, voice quiet. Now I see. More blank space than filled-in lines. I looked up. He wasn't asking for permission, but he wasn't sure how to continue either. You want to finish it? I asked. His answer came not in words, but in a slow inhale. I thought I did, he said. But the more I stare at it, the more it feels like a house built for a ghost. He didn't say her name again, and I didn't push. I ran my fingers lightly over the drawing. What if it wasn't about finishing it the way it was meant to be? He tilted his head, curious. What if it's about starting it again, with different hands? He said nothing for a moment, but I saw it in his face, the quiet ache of possibility rising, cautious and unfamiliar. You mean, change it? He asked. Not change her, I said gently. Change what the house means. He stared at the drawing again. And what would it mean now? I met his eyes. Whatever we want it to. The table held a soft hum of something unsaid, and then he pulled the sketch closer to himself again. I'd want bigger windows, I said suddenly, almost without thinking. More light in the morning. It helps me wake up. He glanced up. She wanted the same. I hesitated. Then maybe that part stays. He smiled. Maybe. We sat side by side that afternoon, elbows bumping sometimes as we redrew certain lines. We crossed out the pantry and replaced it with a small reading nook. We widened the porch, added a railing. I suggested a spot by the fireplace where a plant could go. He marked it with an X. There was no ceremony, just pencil scratches and shared glances. But something changed that day. We weren't building her cabin anymore. We were making ours. From the pieces that had waited too long for breath. At one point, I paused, eyes still on the page. Are you sure you're ready? Jacob didn't flinch. No. His honesty made me exhale something I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But, he added, I'm ready not to carry it alone. That, more than any blueprint, felt like the foundation we needed. The name scribbled in the corner stayed. I didn't ask him to erase it, and he didn't offer. Because healing doesn't mean pretending someone never existed. It just means letting someone else stand beside you, without having to stand in their shadow. Before we put the plan away, I picked up a pencil and wrote a single line beneath the sketch. A home drawn once in grief, now redrawn in grace. Jacob read it. He didn't say anything, but the next morning I found a second sheet clipped to the back. Same layout, slightly different design. At the top, in his handwriting, new draft. L and J. Not E, not replacing, not forgetting. Just redrawing. And finally, choosing. It didn't happen in a single decision. No fireworks. No sunrise epiphanies. Just one morning where I looked at the packed bag by the door and didn't touch it. Then another. Until weeks passed, and the bag became part of the furniture. Forgotten, like a suitcase left behind at a station I never meant to return to. I stayed. Not because Jacob asked, not because of obligation. I stayed because it made sense. Because the mornings didn't feel right unless I heard the soft creak of the barn door. Because coffee didn't taste like coffee unless it was poured into mismatched mugs we never remembered to switch. Because sometimes building a life doesn't start with a plan, it starts with presence. We worked on the cabin in slow layers. Paint went up in blotchy waves. The windows came in late. Storm delayed like most things in this part of the country. But every nail, every brush stroke, was something shared. And that made all the difference. Jacob let me pick the color for the bedroom wall. I chose a soft gray, something between dawn and ash. "Looks like the sky before snow," he said the first time he saw it. "Or right after it melts," I offered. He didn't argue, just nodded. In the afternoons, we started driving into town again. Once a week, he brought wood, or feed. I tagged along. That's when I learned he'd been quietly helping out at the local veterans center. "Only when they need an extra hand," he said, brushing it off. But one day I saw a man my father's age, missing a leg, squeeze Jacob's shoulder like it was the only thing keeping him standing. So I started coming with him, bringing coffee, asking names, listening to stories I didn't expect to carry, but did. They started calling me Sunflower because of the yellow beanie I wore one day during a fundraiser. The name stuck. I didn't mind. There was something about being needed without being demanded. It felt kind. At night, we'd come home covered in paint or sawdust or both. I'd shower first, then fall asleep before the water even stopped running. But some nights, we'd sit on the steps of the nearly finished cabin, staring out at the field behind the barn. "There's a spot by the creek," he said one night, breaking the quiet. "I was thinking of building a bench there." "For who?" I asked. He looked at me. "For us." I felt it then. That shift. That silent, stubborn root that had grown beneath all the days we thought we were just getting by. It wasn't about the house, or the snow, or the past. It was about the bench. The way he said us, like a word he hadn't used in years but finally remembered how to pronounce. I didn't say anything in return. I just reached for his hand, and he didn't let go. It started with oatmeal, the kind I never liked. But Jacob made it anyway, always pretending not to notice I pushed it around the bowl. That morning, though, something changed. I opened the cabinet, reached for the cinnamon, and the smell made my stomach turn. Not just turn, flip. Like the world inside me was rearranging itself in silence. I paused. Then, I laughed. Out loud. Jacob looked up from his mug. "What's funny?" I shook my head, tears threatening the corners of my eyes, for no real reason. "Just hormones, probably." He tilted his head. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think I might be late." He blinked. "For what?" I looked at him, waiting for it to land. Then, slowly, his expression shifted, like a slow sunrise. "Late," he repeated quietly this time. I nodded again. 3 weeks. Silence wrapped around us, but not the kind that used to suffocate. This one was soft, elastic, holding space instead of closing it. "Are you worried?" he asked, voice low. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over to where he sat, pulled his mug from his hands, and sat on his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm not scared," I said. He looked up at me, eyes searching. "Not even a little?" he asked. I smiled. "Jacob, I spent years being scared of everything, of failing, of not being enough, of starting over in cities that didn't remember me 5 minutes after I left. But this," I touched his chest, just above his heart. "This feels like the first thing that might actually remember me." He let out a shaky breath. Then he smiled. And it wasn't the kind he used to give. The polite one, the closed mouth one. This was the kind that cracked something open. He didn't say anything about fate, didn't promise marriage or draw up plans. He just nodded and whispered, "Okay." It was the most honest thing he could have said. Later that day, we walked to the mailbox together. The snow had started melting around the edges, patches of brown grass poking through like bruises fading. As we reached the bend where the path veered left, toward the cabin, I stopped. Jacob turned. I said, "You know, I almost left 2 weeks ago." His eyebrows lifted. "I packed everything. Even wrote a note." "Why didn't you?" I looked toward the creek. There was a bird outside the window. Bright red. Not a cardinal. Some weird hybrid thing. It just sat there, watching me. And I remember thinking, if I leave now, I'll never know what that bird was. He chuckled. You stayed for a bird? I shrugged. I stayed for maybe? He nodded, quiet again. And then, as if remembering something from long ago, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a tiny folded paper crane. The edges were worn, the folds neat. Not new. He handed it to me. I used to keep this in my wallet, he said. I opened it carefully. Inside, scribbled in barely legible ink, was a single word: hope. It wasn't for anyone, he said. Just a reminder. I pressed the paper into my palm. Then maybe it's time it had a second meaning. He kissed my forehead. We didn't say baby. We didn't say parent. We didn't need to. Because in that moment, there were 2 chairs at the table, 2 toothbrushes by the sink, and maybe, just maybe, something else waiting to be named. It took nearly a year. Not to fall in love, but to admit that what we built wasn't just ours. The cabin became something else. It started with one neighbor who needed a warm place to stay after a pipe burst in January. Then a vet who didn't have the heart to return to his old apartment after a panic episode. Then a widow with nowhere to go on Thanksgiving. They kept coming. And we didn't turn them away. Jacob, the man who once bolted every door and sealed off whole rooms, now kept a kettle going all afternoon. The front porch became a waiting room. The kitchen, a gathering place. The old barn, a makeshift supply center filled with donated coats and canned goods. We didn't call it a shelter. We didn't call it a mission. We just called it home. Then one day, a knock on the door changed everything. A woman from the county office stepped inside, looked around, and said, "You know, this could qualify as a community center." Jacob looked at me, half smiling. "You think we're ready for that?" he asked. I looked at the room. Walls painted with care, curtains sewn by hand, coffee cups lined up like soldiers on the counter. I said, "I think we've been ready longer than we knew." The paperwork took months, but eventually it was official. We called it the East Room, because that's where the sun hit first, and because healing, we decided, should begin in the light. One Saturday morning, a van full of high schoolers arrived from the next county, part of some youth program. City kids, faces half curious, half disconnected. Jacob and I stood by the door, coffee in hand as they stepped inside, awkward, fidgeting, unsure. One boy, maybe 16, looked around the living room and asked, "So who built all this?" Jacob didn't hesitate. He placed a hand on my back and said, clear and proud, "She did." The room went still for a beat. I blinked. Not because I hadn't done the work. God knows I had the calluses to prove it, but because Jacob had never used that tone before. Like the words themselves had weight. Like naming me was honoring me. A girl with blue braids raised her hand and asked if we could give them a tour. So we did. We showed them the reading nook by the stove, the mural in the hallway, the baby room no one asked about but everyone secretly visited. As we stood outside afterward, watching them climb back into the van, Jacob leaned toward me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" "That we started all this because I crashed my car." He chuckled. "And because I was too stubborn to let you leave." "No," I corrected gently. "You were kind. Stubborn came later." He smiled. Then his eyes drifted to the eastern window, the one we'd framed together, arguing over which latch to use, laughing when we both got it wrong. Through that window, the sun spilled onto the floorboards, warm, wide, and unwavering. "You know," he said, "I never told you what I thought that first night. When I carried you in from the snow." I turned to him, curious. I thought, God, not again. Another person to lose, another thing to fail at. He paused. "But I didn't fail, and I didn't lose you." "No," I said, sliding my hand into his. "You trusted me." He nodded. "And you trusted me back," he said. And there it was. Not a love story shouted from rooftops, but one whispered in rooms we built from scratch, across cups of coffee, through doors we dared to keep open. I used to think home was a place you returned to. Now I know. It's something you build. From silence and splinters and second chances. The sign on the gate reads, "The East Room." It's carved into cedar, hand-painted by a woman who once refused to speak. She now teaches watercolor on Thursdays. Underneath the name, smaller letters spell, "In honor of the morning she stayed." I never asked Jacob to add that, but when he unveiled the sign during the center's anniversary, I didn't cry. Not then. I waited until nightfall, when everyone had gone home, when the fire pit was down to orange embers and the stars had taken their posts. I stood by the gate, hand tracing the letters, and I remembered. Not the whole story all at once, just flashes. The crunch of snow under my boots that first day, the way the door creaked open like it had forgotten how. The silence inside his cabin. Not heavy, not hostile, just waiting. I remembered the locked doors, the towel rack with only one towel, the coffee he brewed for himself, never assuming I'd want a cup. I remembered watching his hands, how gentle they were with the horses, how they trembled only when he thought no one was watching. And then, there was that night. The storm had trapped us together, yes, but it had also freed us. We had no electricity, no heat except the fire, no distractions. So we talked. He told me about the woman he once loved, the one who left because he couldn't promise anything, the one whose name he never said, but whose absence echoed in every room. I told him about my mother, how she believed people turned into stars when they died, and how, after she passed, I spent months looking up, hoping one of them would blink at me. And then we fell asleep. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. That night, when we came together, I told him it was my first time. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just leaned in and whispered something I'll never forget. "You don't owe me anything." 6 words, but they were a bridge I'd never known I needed. The next morning, I saw the blood on the sheets. I panicked, thought maybe he'd regret it. Maybe I'd ruined something. But he came in carrying wildflowers, set a mug of cocoa on the nightstand, kissed my temple, and said, "Still here?" Still here. That became our inside joke, our quiet promise. Still here. Through power outages, through pregnancy nausea, through zoning paperwork and plumbing disasters. Still here. When I wanted to run, and when he finally said, "I love you," not as a revelation, but as a truth that had always been waiting. Tonight, as I stand by the gate, the wind lifts my scarf gently. Inside, I hear voices. People playing cards, someone tuning a guitar, a child laughing down the hallway. Jacob's silhouette appears in the doorway. He doesn't call out, just waits. And I know, he's still here too. Before I turn to join him, I whisper something to the sign. "Thank you for not letting me leave that day." Because I almost did. I almost mistook safety for stagnation, almost believed the lie that broken means unworthy. But I stayed. Because someone whispered grace into a moment I once thought shameful. Because a red thread on white sheets became the beginning, not the end. Because this house, this man, this life, they didn't save me. They let me save myself. And that, I've learned, is the only kind of love that lasts.